Nonetheless, we haven't seen any real change in policy toward Cuba. Haiti would be a great project. Haiti is really a great shame for the United States that we have a country so close to our borders that is living on the standards of an African nation in such dire poverty even before the recent catastrophe. It's hard to figure out in great detail why things happen like Haiti developing into such a failed state, but we do know one thing about Haiti, that Haiti has been the subject of repeated American interventions for nearly 100 years. And then we know that Haiti today is a disaster. Now, whether that's the only cause of it, you could argue. Nonetheless, those are two facts. And for the United States maybe to assume a role in trying to think of a long-term future for Haiti might be another Latin America project for the Obama administration. There's some very interesting leaders emerging in Latin America. You wonder if the president might not want to have a relationship with 2 or 3 of them in which he would be in regular contact and try to help shape his policy towards Latin America through contacts and advice from friends there. You don't really get a sense that anybody is focusing on Latin America. In fact, it's only just been a month or two since the Obama administration named its Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America. For the first practically year of the Obama administration, we were still working with this person that Bush had put in there. I think you can see this in a lot of different parts of the world, even with our big projects like China. What is going to be our relationship with China over the long term? Are we rivals of China? Can we be partners with China? What's going to be the framework? What are we trying to achieve with China? I don't think that people have really thought this through in Washington in a new way. Same thing is true about Russia. What about Europe? To my mind, if the United States is going to unite with another pole in the world in the future, Europe would be a logical candidate. So what is our long-term Atlantic relationship? Being an Atlanticist, meaning someone who believes in close ties between Europe and the United States, was essentially something that a lot of Europeans wanted to be. Now I think it's something for Americans to think about, that maybe the Atlanticist idea is going to be something very important for us in the future, since we are no longer going to be the sole kings of the hill. But I don't sense that that project either has a firm shape or a great momentum. Now, the place in the world that is the focus of world crisis is and has been for a number of years the Middle East. For better or worse, the Middle East crisis, and if you want to narrow it down, even the Israel-Palestine crisis, has become the world's crisis. Because of this crisis, many other problems cannot be solved. And intensifying hatreds in that part of the world are producing global threats that go far beyond the Middle East. And we know that in the United States, as many other countries do, that have been the victim of terror attacks that in some way can be traced to the upheaval in that part of the world. Now, there's probably nowhere in the world where it would be more urgent and more welcome to see a coherent, carefully thought out long-term strategy for the United States. The Middle East is crying out for new thinking. It's quite clear that the policies the United States has been following for some decades now have not produced a peaceful or a stable Middle East. You just need to look in your daily newspaper to find that out. And I'm, of course, using that phrase in a symbolic sense. You look on your daily newspaper that's on your computer, of course. In fact, the Middle East is a pit of violence and hatred and terror and conflict. So whatever policies we have been following and the world has been following to stabilize the Middle East have not worked. I think that's clear. So what might work? What could be a new paradigm? Before I try to give my own answer to that question, let me talk about why it's such a difficult question to answer for the American foreign policy establishment. Probably there is more talent in the foreign policy area in Washington, D.C. than there is in any city in the world. The foreign policy thinkers there form a critical mass that you don't really see anywhere else in the world in terms of intensity and breadth. But this foreign policy establishment in the United States, which is based heavily in Washington, suffers from an ailment that afflicts policymaking in other areas too, perhaps to a lesser degree. And that is that there are certain inherited paradigms, certain assumptions that limit our freedom of action. We feel that we have to accept this and we have to accept that, and this, of course, has to be part of our policy. And by the time we've decided what are the range of our options, we've narrowed them down tremendously. The range of acceptable options that's considered in Washington is so narrow that any hint of new ideas or original thinking is treated as the germ of a horrific plague that must be stamped out before it infects the entire foreign policy establishment and leads us to whole new ideas and new concepts and new approaches. There is an instinctive reaction against any new and innovative thinking in the foreign policy business, even more than I think in many areas of domestic policy. It reminds me actually of a story I once read about the famous movie star Tallulah Bankhead, who was quite a famous diva in her era. And according to this story I read, she went to see a play on Broadway where some other diva was the star, and on the way out somebody said to her, so what did you think of her performance? And Tallulah replied, she ran the gamut of emotions from A to B. That's a little bit like the very narrow range of options that we allow to be considered in our foreign policy thinking. So even before you get to the question of what would be a good approach to Latin America or Europe or Russia or China or the Middle East, you have to face this first question, which is, how do you get people to be open to new approaches? Now, this mentality that so heavily dominates and entraps the foreign policy establishment in Washington is based largely on a set of assumptions that come out of an imperial culture. It is assumed by most of these foreign policy thinkers in Washington that there are a lot of very important, urgent things that need to be done in the world, and that only the United States can do them. There are very few people in the rest of the world that believe this. But the United States is very much caught in this idea that we are, as Secretary of State Albright once put it, the indispensable nation. Not only are we indispensable, but we're the indispensable nation. All other nations can come or go. In fact, Americans look at the world very differently from everybody else in the world. And I think this is the key difference. In other countries, including in big and powerful countries like China or Russia or Brazil, most people think of the world as being made up of lots of different countries. We're one country. There's another country over there. There's another country over here. Altogether, all of us countries make up the world. Americans don't think like this. Americans believe that the world is divided into two groups of countries. One group is the United States. The other group is all the other countries. And if there's one thing that all those countries have in common, it's that the people who live there are naturally frustrated and unhappy because they don't have the only thing in the world that's really worth having, which is the chance to be American. This view separates us from everyone else in the world. We really separate ourselves from the world by thinking that the whole world depends on us, and without us, the world is going to disaster. Therefore, even in countries that are not asking for our help, that don't realize how much they need our help, we need to go over and show them how to do things right. We essentially believe that we've been given the key. We've been given the magic formula for how a country can be stable and prosperous and successful.